Have you ever had that feeling, that deep primal prickling on the back of your neck? The one that tells you without a doubt that you are being watched? It's a feeling that often comes out of the deep, quiet dark. When you're driving down a lonely road or sitting alone in a silent house. Most of us, being products of a rational age, dismiss it. A trick of the light, the wind rustling through the leaves, an overactive imagination fueled by too many late-night movies. We have logical minds, and our world is built on the foundation of finding logical explanations. We look for the familiar. But what if, for 13 terrifying months, an entire town felt like it was being watched? What if the collective imagination of a whole community was seized by something that defied every rational explanation they had? What if the shadow you glimpse in the periphery wasn't just a shadow? What if it had a shape, a form? What if it had huge, leathery wings, a towering, headless body, and two giant, hypnotic, burning red eyes? Tonight, we are not just telling a monster story. We are traveling back in time to the small, unassuming town of Point Pleasant, West Virginia, during a period when it felt like the veil between our world and something else grew terrifyingly, impossibly thin. This is a story about more than just a cryptid. It's a story about a premonition, a contagion of fear, and a wave of inexplicable phenomena that gripped a community and refused to let go. It's about a series of bizarre and frightening events that culminated in a devastating, heart-wrenching tragedy, forever linking the appearance of a terrifying creature to one of the worst structural disasters in American history. This is a story that forces us to ask a deeply unsettling question. Do some paranormal creatures exist not to cause harm, but as a dire warning of it? Or is their very presence a catalyst for chaos, a crack in reality through which tragedy can pour? This is the sprawling, enigmatic, and ultimately heartbreaking story of the creature known to the world as Mothman. Before we can even begin to comprehend the creature, we must first understand the place. In the mid-1960s, Point Pleasant, West Virginia, was, by all accounts, the quintessential American small town. It was a picture postcard of mid-century life. Nestled at the confluence of the mighty Ohio and Kanawha rivers, it was a peaceful, industrious, and deeply close-knit community. Life moved at a different pace there. It was slow, predictable, centered around family, church, and the local high school football team. People knew their neighbors, they left their doors unlocked, and the biggest news in the local paper, the Point Pleasant Register, was usually about a town council meeting or a prize-winning pumpkin at the county fair. It was, in short, the very last place on Earth you would ever expect to become the epicenter of one of the most intense, bizarre, and well-documented paranormal flaps of the 20th century. But like many quiet towns, Point Pleasant had a secret. A place on its outskirts that held a strange and ominous energy, a place that seemed to hum with a different kind of frequency. It was a sprawling, nearly 8,000-acre tract of wilderness known to every local as the TNT area. This wasn't just a nickname, it was a literal description. During the frantic years of World War II, this land had been the site of the West Virginia Ordnance Works, a massive, government-run facility for the manufacturing and storage of military-grade munitions, dynamite, TNT, and all the volatile ingredients of war. It was a place of immense power and potential destruction hidden away in the Appalachian Hills. After the war, the plant was decommissioned. The factories fell silent, the machinery was carted away, and the area was effectively abandoned, left to rust and be slowly, relentlessly reclaimed by nature. What was left behind was a scar on the landscape, a concrete skeleton half buried in the encroaching forest. It became a strange and eerie maze of crumbling roads that led to nowhere, deep, dark tunnels that echoed with dripping water, and, most iconically, dozens of massive, grass-covered concrete domes, or igloos, that were once used for storing high explosives. These structures dotted the landscape like ancient burial mounds from a lost, industrial civilization. The TNT area became a kind of shadowland for the town. It was a popular spot for teenagers to park their cars, a place for hunters to track deer, and, as it would turn out, the perfect, desolate nesting ground for a waking nightmare. Our story, the story of the 13 months of fear, begins not with a blood-curdling scream, but with the quiet, rhythmic scrape of shovels against the earth. The date is November 12, 1966. In the nearby town of Clendenin, 5 men are working in a cemetery. They are gravediggers performing a solemn and ordinary task they've performed 100 times before. The air is still, the mood is somber. As they work, their movements synchronized by long practice, something catches the eye of one of the men. He looks up and then the others follow his gaze. Soaring silently over the tops of the autumn trees is something that simply does not belong. It was, as they later struggled to describe it to anyone who would listen, a brown human being. It wasn't a bird, it wasn't a plane, it wasn't a balloon. It was unmistakably man-shaped, but it had wings, and it moved with an eerie, unnatural grace. It flew low and silent over their heads before banking and disappearing from view. The men were profoundly shaken. They were practical men, men who dealt with the finality of death every day, and they had no frame of reference for what they had just witnessed. They were gravediggers who had seen an omen, a portent in the sky, though they couldn't possibly know it yet. The very first recorded sighting of the creature that would soon terrorize the entire region had just occurred. 3 nights later, on the cold, moonless night of November 15th, the legend of the Mothman would be truly and irrevocably born. 2 young married couples, Roger and Linda Scarberry, and Steve and Mary Malatoir, doing what young people in a small town with little to do often did. They were piling into a car and driving around, chasing away boredom. Their aimless journey took them, fatefully, into the dark heart of the TNT area. As Roger Scarberry drove his black 1957 Chevy slowly down one of the crumbling, overgrown access roads, the car's headlights cut a nervous path through the darkness. They passed the skeletal remains of one of the abandoned power plants, a hulking, rust-streaked structure that loomed like a haunted cathedral in the night. Suddenly, Linda Scarberry gasped, a sharp intake of breath that was part fear, part disbelief. Her cry made everyone in the car snap to attention and look where she was pointing. There, standing in the deep shadows next to the generator building, was a figure. It was a moment frozen in time, an image burned into their minds forever. It was, they would later recount, about 6 or 7 feet tall and shaped like a man, but a grotesque parody of one. It was broad, gray, and seemed to have no discernible head or neck. Instead, 2 enormous, glowing red eyes were set directly into its upper torso, staring out at them from the darkness. As they sat there, the 4 of them trapped in the car, frozen in a silent tableau of shared terror, a pair of huge, bat-like wings with a wingspan they estimated to be at least 10 feet, slowly and deliberately unfolded from its back. The spell was broken. Primal fear took over. Roger Scarberry, who was driving, slammed his foot on the gas pedal. The Chevy's tires screamed as they bit into the loose gravel, the back of the car fishtailing wildly as he wrenched the wheel and sped away from the monstrous apparition. But their horror was just beginning. They thought they were escaping, but as they reached the main paved road, Route 62, heading back toward the relative safety of Point Pleasant, Mary Millette looked out the back window and screamed. It was following them. But it wasn't flying in a straight line. It was soaring from side to side over the car, a dark, winged shape against the starry sky, its massive wings seemingly not even flapping. It was just gliding, effortlessly keeping pace with them as Roger pushed the car faster and faster, the speedometer needle climbing past 80, 90, then 100 miles per hour. The creature emitted a strange, high-pitched squeaking sound, a noise they later described as being like a giant mouse or a recording played at the wrong speed. The couples were frantic, overcome with a claustrophobic panic inside the speeding car. They were convinced this thing was toying with them, that at any moment it would descend and tear the roof off the car. They raced into the town of Point Pleasant, not daring to slow down, running stop signs, their only thought to reach the light and the presence of other people. They didn't stop until they screeched to a halt in the lighted entrance of the Mason County Courthouse. Only then, as they looked back, did they see the creature peel off, banking into the darkness and disappearing over the Ohio River. Shaking, crying, and hysterical, they burst into the sheriff's office. Deputy Millard Halstead was on duty that night. He knew the Scarberrys and the Millettes. They weren't known as troublemakers. They weren't drinkers, they didn't do drugs, and they weren't prone to telling wild, elaborate stories. As he listened to their panicked, overlapping account of a giant, winged man with glowing red eyes, he saw the genuine, unadulterated terror in their eyes. They were genuinely scared, he later told reporters in a quote that would be printed again and again. "I've known these kids all their lives. They'd never been in any trouble and they were really scared. I took them seriously." Halstead got into his patrol car and followed Roger Scarberry back out to the TNT area. They swept the area around the old power plant with their flashlights, but they found nothing. No tracks, no feathers, no physical sign of the creature. It was as if it had been a phantom, but something had happened out there. When Roger returned home, he and his wife were too terrified to stay in their own house. They packed a bag and went to stay with the Millettes, huddling together for safety. They were haunted by the image of those two glowing red eyes, an image they felt was psychically burned into their brains. They were the first to have such a close, terrifying encounter, but they would be far from the last to see the creature that a local newspaper reporter, struggling to find a name for this bizarre being, would soon christen Mothman, a name inspired by the campy Batman TV series that was popular at the time. The story hit the Associated Press wire, and suddenly the floodgates opened. It turned out that other people in the Ohio Valley had been seeing strange things for weeks, even months, but they had been too afraid or too embarrassed to speak up, fearing ridicule. Now, emboldened by the credible and terrified testimony of the two young couples, they came forward. The flap, a term used by paranormal investigators to describe a concentrated series of UFO or cryptid sightings in a specific geographical area, had officially begun. Point Pleasant was now on the map for a reason it never wanted. One of the most chilling and tragic of these newly revealed encounters happened to a man named Newell Partridge, a local building contractor who lived in the nearby, more rural town of Salem. On the exact same night as the Scarberry's terrifying chase, around 10:30 p.m., Partridge was at home watching television. Suddenly, his TV set went haywire. The picture on the screen dissolved into a strange, shifting, herringbone pattern, and a loud, high-pitched whining sound filled the room, rising and falling in pitch. At the same moment, his German Shepherd, a loyal and protective dog named Bandit, began howling furiously on the front porch. Partridge, annoyed and a little unnerved, grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight and went outside to investigate. He figured it was a fox or a raccoon riling up the dog. As he shone the powerful beam of his flashlight toward his hay barn, about 150 yards away, the light didn't just illuminate the barn doors. It reflected off two huge, red, circular lights. They weren't animal eyes. They were too big, too perfectly round, too luminous. They looked, he said, exactly like bicycle reflectors. As he stood there on his porch, paralyzed by the bizarre sight, a deep sense of dread and unnatural, irrational fear washed over him. It was a feeling he had never experienced before. A cold wave of terror that told him he was in the presence of something deeply wrong, something dangerous. He screamed for Bandit to come back to the house, but the dog, a brave and foolish protector, shot off the porch and raced toward the barn, barking furiously at the two red eyes glowing in the darkness. Partridge, overcome with the fear he couldn't explain or control, did something he was later ashamed of. He ran back inside, slammed the door, and locked it. He spent the rest of the night huddled in his house, his hunting rifle by his bed, listening. The next morning, there was a deafening silence. Bandit was gone. Newell Partridge searched for his dog for days, calling his name until his voice was hoarse. He never saw Bandit again. All he ever found were a few muddy tracks circling and circling the barn. He was so disturbed and heartbroken by the event that when he later read the newspaper account of the Scarberrys describing a creature with two giant, glowing red eyes, a cold certainty gripped him. He became convinced that whatever they saw, whatever that thing was, it had taken his dog. The sightings began to cascade, each one adding a new, frightening layer to the growing legend of the Mothman. On November 25th, just 10 days after the initial chase, A shoe salesman named Tom Urey was driving home on Route 62, not far from the TNT area. He was a sober, reliable family man. He saw a tall, grayish figure standing in a field by the side of the road. Thinking it might be a person in trouble, he slowed his car down. As he did, the figure spread a pair of enormous wings and took off vertically, like a helicopter, ascending straight up into the air without making a single sound. It then banked and flew over his car, disappearing into the sky. Urey, like every single person who had a close encounter, reported being gripped by that same inexplicable, profound terror. Perhaps one of the most intimate and terrifying encounters of all befell a young mother named Marcella Bennett and her family just one day later, on November 26th. She was driving to visit her brother and his wife, Raymond and Kathy Walmsley, who lived in a small house right on the very edge of the TNT area, their property backing up against the wilderness. She pulled up to the house and got out of the car, carrying her infant daughter, Tina. As her friends emerged from the house to greet her, a strange, clumsy, gray figure seemed to rise up from the ground beside her car as if it had been lying there, waiting. It was huge, bigger than a man, with those same terrible, self-illuminated, glowing red eyes. Marcella was so profoundly shocked, so paralyzed by the sudden appearance of this monstrosity, that her arms went limp and she dropped her baby onto the ground. For a heart-stopping moment, she was completely frozen, her mind unable to process the horror in front of her. Her friend, Raymond Walmsley, reacting on pure instinct, snatched up the child from the ground, and they all scrambled frantically back into the house, slamming and locking the door behind them. The creature, with a strange, shuffling gait, followed them. It came up onto the small porch and peered in through the living room window, its hypnotic red eyes scanning the room, seeming to look right through them. They cowered inside, listening to it circle the small house for what felt like an eternity, its strange, shuffling footsteps audible on the porch before it finally moved off into the darkness. When the police arrived, summoned by a frantic phone call, they once again found nothing. But Marcella Bennett was deeply traumatized, so much so that she required medical care for nervous shock and would suffer from recurring nightmares of those red eyes for years to come. Over the next 13 months, from November of 1966 to December of 1967, over 100 different people in the Point Pleasant area would report seeing the Mothman. The descriptions from these disparate witnesses, many of whom did not know each other, were remarkably, chillingly consistent. A winged, humanoid figure standing between 6 and 7 feet tall. Its color was usually described as gray or brownish. It had a massive wingspan estimated at 10 to 15 feet. And always, the two large, hypnotic, glowing red eyes. Witnesses consistently reported that it never seemed to flap its wings like a bird, but it could fly at incredible, impossible speeds, easily pacing cars going over 100 miles per hour. It never seemed to be overtly hostile, it never attacked anyone directly apart from the presumed fate of Bandit the dog. But its very presence, its proximity, induced a profound, bone-deep, psychic terror in all who witnessed it. This was not just some unknown animal, some out-of-place cryptid. It was a powerful paranormal creature that seemed to feed on fear, or at least generate it as a byproduct of its existence. As the sightings mounted and the news spread, Point Pleasant transformed. It was no longer a quiet, sleepy river town. It became a media sensation, a destination for the curious and the brave. Reporters from across the country, self-styled monster hunters with cameras and nets, and paranormal investigators flocked to the town. But something else was happening, something even stranger, if that's even possible, than the Mothman sightings themselves. The town became a veritable magnet for all manner of high strangeness. The Mothman wasn't alone. UFO sightings, which had already been occurring with some regularity in the Ohio Valley for years, increased dramatically. People reported seeing strange, silent, multicolored lights in the sky, often hovering over the TNT area or the Ohio River. There were reports of silent, black, triangular craft moving with impossible speed and agility. People saw mysterious orbs of light that would pace their cars or dart through the woods. The skies over Point Pleasant became a theater of the bizarre. And then came the men in black. This is the point in the story where the Mothman legend transcends a simple monster hunt and spirals into the realm of a full-blown, high-level conspiracy. Several of the key Mothman witnesses, as well as local journalists who were covering the story, reported being visited by strange, deeply unsettling men. They weren't your typical G-men, not FBI or CIA agents in the traditional sense. Witnesses described them as being profoundly odd, almost inhuman. They often wore brand new, but ill-fitting, black suits, as if they were unaccustomed to wearing them. Their skin was sometimes described as being oddly dark, like a deep tan, or unnaturally pale and waxy, with stiff, plastic-like complexions. Their facial features were sometimes described as blurry or undefined. Their movements were often jerky and robotic. They traveled in pristine, gleaming black cars, usually vintage Cadillacs or Buicks that looked like they had just rolled off a 1940s showroom floor, despite it being the late 1960s. These men in black, or MBs as they came to be known, would show up unannounced at witnesses' homes, often late at night. They would ask bizarre, circular, and often intimidating questions about the witnesses' sightings. They seemed to know intimate details about the witnesses' lives, things that no stranger could possibly know. They often spoke in a strange, monotone, or unnatural sing-song voice. They would frequently attempt to confiscate any photos or physical evidence the witnesses had, and they would warn them, sometimes subtly, sometimes with overt threats, to stop talking about what they had seen. Their visits left witnesses feeling confused, terrified, and often physically ill. One of the central figures in this part of the sprawling story was a man named John Keel. Keel was a New York-based journalist and author, a pioneering investigator of the weird. He wasn't a wide-eyed believer in the classic sense. He was a hard-nosed, skeptical investigator who was drawn to bizarre phenomena. He came to Point Pleasant in 1966 to investigate the Mothman phenomenon for a magazine article, thinking he would be there for a few weeks, debunk a local monster story, and leave. Instead, he stayed for over a year, and the experience would change his life and his entire understanding of reality. Keel meticulously documented not only the Mothman sightings but also the accompanying UFO flap and the terrifying encounters with the men in black. He became a confidant for many of the frightened witnesses who were afraid to go to the police. He became convinced that all of these disparate, bizarre phenomena were inextricably connected. Keel's primary contact and collaborator in town was a woman named Mary Heyer. Heyer was the Point Pleasant correspondent for the Athens Messenger, a regional newspaper. She was a respected, no-nonsense journalist and the central hub for all the strange stories pouring in from the community. Her small newspaper office became the unofficial headquarters for the investigation. Heyer herself began to experience an onslaught of high strangeness. She received bizarre phone calls to her office where the person on the other end would speak in a strange, metallic, electronic-sounding voice, or there would just be beeping and whining sounds. She, too, was visited by men in black who warned her to be careful with her reporting. Most ominously, she began to have a recurring, vivid, and terrifying prophetic dream, a dream of the Ohio River overflowing with floating Christmas packages and the bodies of drowning people. A palpable sense of dread, a psychic tension, was building in the town. It was a feeling that all the strangeness, the Mothman, the UFOs, the men in black, the prophetic dreams was not random. It was a prelude. It was a crescendo. The feeling, shared by Keel, Heyer, and many of the witnesses, was that Point Pleasant was on a countdown to some unknown, but imminent, catastrophe. John Keel, based on his exhaustive on-the-ground investigation, began to formulate a radical and complex theory. He no longer believed that Mothman was a biological creature, a flesh-and-blood cryptid like Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster. Its ability to appear and disappear at will, its apparent invulnerability, its direct association with UFOs and other paranormal phenomena, all pointed to something else. He proposed that Mothman and the other entities plaguing Point Pleasant were what he called ultraterrestrials, beings or intelligences from another dimension, a parallel reality, or even a different point in time, that were briefly and clumsily intersecting with our own reality. He believed these entities were not necessarily good or evil in a human sense, but that their very presence in our reality caused physical and psychic disruptions, like ripples in a pond when a stone is thrown in. And he came to the chilling conclusion that Mothman was not a monster to be feared, but an omen to be heeded. A desperate, silent harbinger of a terrible doom that was about to befall the unsuspecting town of Point Pleasant. As 1967 drew to its cold, dark close, the Mothman sightings began to dwindle in frequency. The media frenzy died down and the monster hunters went home. A tense, uneasy calm settled over the town, but for those who had been at the center of the storm, the feeling of impending dread remained thicker than ever. Mary Hyer's dream of the river and the drowning people became more frequent, more intense. The countdown was nearing its final, terrible seconds. December 15, 1967. It was a cold, gray, overcast Friday afternoon. The Christmas season was in full swing. The streets of Point Pleasant were decorated, and the mood was festive, despite the lingering weirdness of the past year. Rush hour traffic was thick on the Silver Bridge, the vital, aging artery that connected Point Pleasant, West Virginia, with its neighbor across the river, Gallipolis, Ohio. The bridge, an iconic local landmark built in 1928, was an I-bar suspension bridge. It was an innovative design for its time, but one that contained a single, critical, and ultimately fatal flaw. The entire massive structure was held up by just 2 chains of high-strength steel I-bars, with absolutely no redundancy. If a single, critical link in that chain failed, the entire bridge would fail with it. At around 5 p.m., as the light began to fade, hundreds of cars were either on the bridge, packed bumper to bumper, or waiting to cross. Suddenly, witnesses on the shore heard a loud, sharp crack, like a rifle shot echoing across the water. A single, critical I-bar in the northern suspension chain, weakened by 40 years of microscopic corrosion and the immense stress of the holiday traffic, had fractured. In a horrifying instant, a catastrophic chain reaction began. With a sound described by survivors as a sickening, grinding, metallic roar, the entire Silver Bridge twisted and contorted like a dying animal before completely collapsing into the icy, churning, 25-foot-deep waters of the Ohio River. Took less than a minute. One moment, there was a bridge full of people on their way home from work or out to do their Christmas shopping. The next moment, there was nothing but a gaping hole in the sky and a churning mass of twisted steel and sinking cars in the river below. Dozens of cars and trucks plunged into the freezing water. The scene was one of utter chaos, disbelief, and unimaginable horror. Emergency crews rushed to the scene, but the frigid water temperatures, the strong river current, and the sheer scale of the disaster made rescue efforts a nightmare. In the end, 46 people lost their lives in the collapse of the Silver Bridge. 2 of those victims were never found, their bodies claimed forever by the dark waters of the Ohio. It was a staggering national tragedy and a devastating, soul-crushing blow to the small, close-knit town of Point Pleasant. In the days and weeks of shock and grief that followed the disaster, a chilling realization began to dawn on the people of the Ohio Valley. As investigators and reporters pieced together the final hours before the collapse, scattered reports emerged. Reports from people who claimed they had seen the Mothman perched on the superstructure of the Silver Bridge in the days and even hours leading up to the collapse. And then came the most telling fact of all. After December 15, 1967, the Mothman sighting stopped. Completely. The creature, whatever it was, whatever it wanted, had vanished as suddenly and as mysteriously as it had first appeared. The 13-month reign of terror was over, capped by an exclamation point of tragedy. This is the absolute heart of the Mothman legend. It is the terrible, unanswerable question that has haunted researchers, writers, and enthusiasts for over half a century. Was there a connection? Was the appearance of this terrifying paranormal creature and the subsequent horrific tragedy a 1 in a billion horrifying coincidence? Or was it something more? Was the entire year-long spectacle of fear a prelude to this one awful event? This is where we must step back from the terrifying narrative and try, as best we can, to examine the theories, to sift through the strangeness and the sorrow, and attempt to make some sense of this deeply strange and tragic story. The first, most enduring, and most romantic theory is the one first truly articulated by John Keel and now deeply embedded in American folklore. Mothman as a harbinger of doom. In this view, the creature was not malevolent. It wasn't the cause of the disaster. It was a kind of supernatural smoke detector, an otherworldly omen drawn to the building psychic energy of an impending catastrophe. Its purpose was not to frighten, but to warn, even if its warning was incomprehensible to the humans who received it. This idea has deep, ancient roots in global mythology. We see it in the tales of the Banshee in Irish lore, whose mournful wail foretells an imminent death in a family, or the black dog of English folklore that appears as an omen of death. Could Mothman be a modern-day, American industrial version of such a being? Proponents of this theory point to the most compelling piece of evidence. The sighting stopped immediately after the collapse, as if its grim purpose had been fulfilled. They also point to other, though far less substantiated, claims of Mothman-like creatures being sighted near other disaster sites around the world, from a mine collapse in Germany to the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. Then we must give equal time to the skeptical explanation, misidentification. This theory posits that what over 100 credible, sober, and terrified witnesses saw was not a cryptid but a known animal viewed under stressful, low-light conditions and then distorted by fear, folklore, and the power of suggestion. The leading candidate for this theory has always been the sandhill crane. These are very large birds with wingspans that can reach over 7 feet and they can stand nearly as tall as a man. They have a grayish-brown coloration and, most tellingly, distinctive bright reddish patches of bare skin around their eyes. When a flashlight or a headlight beam hits these patches at night, they can appear to glow an intense red. The cranes also emit a strange, rattling, croaking cry. Could a displaced sandhill crane, or perhaps a whole flock of them, have taken up temporary residence in the secluded TNT area and been responsible for the sightings? It's plausible to a point. It explains the size, the color, and potentially the glowing eyes. But does it truly explain a creature that can keep pace with a car traveling at 100 miles per hour? Does it explain the profound, unnatural, psychic terror it induced in nearly every witness? And would so many people, many of whom were experienced hunters and outdoorsmen familiar with local wildlife, mistake a large bird for a headless, winged man? Another candidate is a large owl like a barred owl or a great horned owl whose eyes can reflect brightly in a flashlight beam and whose flight is eerily silent. But again, the sheer size and reported flight capabilities described by witnesses seem to stretch this explanation to its absolute breaking point. A third and very powerful theory falls into the realm of psychology and sociology. Mass hysteria, or more accurately, a collective behavior phenomenon. This theory suggests that the story began with a single, genuinely frightening, but likely misinterpreted, sighting by the Scarberrys and Millettes. Their terrifying story, amplified and sensationalized by the local and national media, then took on a life of its own. In a small town already primed by a backdrop of Cold War anxiety, UFO stories, and the genuinely eerie atmosphere of the TNT area, people began to see what they expected to see. Every shadow in the woods, every strange noise in the night, was interpreted through the powerful lens of the Mothman legend. The shared anxiety and the power of suggestion created a potent feedback loop, generating more sightings and more fear. The Men in Black reports could be explained as either overzealous, socially awkward government investigators looking into the UFO reports, or simply as cruel pranksters taking advantage of the town's heightened state of fear. In this view, the Mothman wasn't really in the woods of West Virginia. It was in the collective consciousness of the town. The tragic collapse of the Silver Bridge was a real, but entirely unrelated, tragedy that was retroactively and powerfully fused onto the legend, giving the story a dramatic, meaningful, and prophetic conclusion that it otherwise would have lacked. It gave meaning to the meaningless terror. And finally, there is the most out there theory, the one favored by John Keel and a whole generation of paranormal researchers he inspired, the ultraterrestrial hypothesis. This theory suggests that we are dealing with forces and intelligences that are simply beyond our current, limited, three-dimensional understanding of reality. Beings or intelligences that can slip in and out of our dimension, whose motives are utterly alien and unknowable, and whose very presence disrupts the fabric of our physical world. This theory is compelling precisely because it is the only one that attempts to unify all the bizarre, disparate elements of the story: the winged creature, the swarms of UFOs, the sinister men in black, the prophetic dreams, the poltergeist activity, the strange phone calls, and the prophetic nature of the entire affair. It suggests the Mothman was not just a harbinger of the disaster, but a part of a whole constellation of strange, interdimensional phenomena that were drawn to Point Pleasant like cosmic moths to a flame, all culminating in the very real, very physical, and very tragic collapse of the Silver Bridge. It is absolutely crucial to remember the official, scientific cause of the Silver Bridge disaster. A meticulous, year-long investigation by the National Transportation Safety Board revealed that a tiny, 0.1-inch deep stress crack in a single eye-bar, number 330, on the northern suspension chain, was the sole culprit. This tiny flaw, caused by a combination of years of unseen corrosion and metal fatigue, finally gave way under the weight of the rush-hour traffic. It was a tragic, heartbreaking failure of engineering, materials science, and inspection protocols. It was a mundane and all-too-human error. There was no monster with red eyes that tore the bridge down. But that cold, hard fact doesn't answer the bigger, more unsettling question. It doesn't explain what dozens and dozens of sane, sober, credible people saw in the woods and skies around Point Pleasant for 13 months. It doesn't explain the hypnotic, glowing red eyes or the terrifying visits from the men in black. And most of all, it doesn't explain the chilling, almost literary symmetry of the 13 months of terror ending on the exact day of the town's greatest tragedy. Today, Point Pleasant has learned to live with its strange and tragic legacy. It has embraced it. There is a world-famous Mothman museum downtown filled with witness accounts and artifacts from the era. A magnificent 12-foot-tall polished stainless steel statue of the creature stands in the center of town, its metal wings spread and its red eyes staring out at passers-by. And every September, the town hosts the annual Mothman Festival, an event that draws thousands of visitors, believers, skeptics, and the curious from all over the world. The town has transformed its period of intense, collective terror into a quirky, defining feature of its identity. But the story of the Mothman is so much more than just a local legend or a piece of kitschy pop culture. It remains one of the most compelling, complex, and deeply disturbing cases in the entire annals of paranormal research. It forces us to confront the fragile boundaries of our own perceived reality. What was this creature? Was it a genuine warning from another dimension that we were unable to comprehend? Was it a misunderstood animal, its reputation inflated by fear? Was it a mass delusion, a psychological projection of a town's buried anxieties? Or was it simply a dark, meaningless shadow that fell over a small American town, a shadow that took the shape of our deepest fears right before a real-world nightmare came true? The mystery endures precisely because there is no easy answer. The story sits uncomfortably at the strange intersection of hard fact, haunting folklore, and human tragedy, a place where the rational, explainable world seems to fray at the edges and let something else peek through. So now I have to turn the question over to you. After hearing the accounts, the details, the terror, and the tragedy, what do you believe the Mothman was? A harbinger of doom, a flesh-and-blood cryptid, a case of mass hysteria, or something far stranger still? Why do you think these paranormal creatures, if they do exist, seem to be so often drawn to places of future tragedy? Let me know your thoughts, your interpretations, and your own theories down in the comments. I am always fascinated to read the different ways people try to make sense of these deep, uncharted mysteries. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the legend of one of America's most famous and unsettling paranormal creatures, please be sure to like this video and subscribe for more journeys into the world's strangest and most inexplicable stories. Thank you for listening. And the next time you find yourself on a lonely road at night and you feel that primal, prickling sensation on the back of your neck, the next time you see a strange shadow in the dark, just hope it doesn't have glowing red eyes.